Remember to hit. There we go. So one of the things I hope to do with you today, and we're now kind of turning the final lap in this lecture series, is to think about both the technological and the political dimensions. I feel like we've focused primarily on the existential and philosophical dimensions of this new technology that we are, I think, in many respects, blindsided by the new artificial intelligence, machine learning, generative AI technology that is now ubiquitous. And for a long time, as I suggested last week, it has been present kind of beneath the surface of much of the technology that we use to power our commercial digital information-based society. But in the 2020s, it seems to have really come to the fore. Many more of us are now interacting with it. At the college I teach at, we're having a debate about, well, do we just want to keep our students from using it because we want them to keep using their minds as opposed to outsourcing their thinking to a chatbot, and then maybe the best opportunity they have to learn to think, their 4 years in college, they don't take advantage of? Or do we have to recognize that for the foreseeable future, perhaps the rest of human history, however long that goes on, we are going to be interacting with intelligent machines, and we need to prepare our students for the world in which they are required to do this, to be employed, to be full and equal citizens, to understand the world around them. And not only that, maybe there's a learning opportunity here. It's interesting. The artists are the ones who have most embraced the artificial intelligence technology at my school. And I have to say, we're a little bit countercultural at Sarah Lawrence, and so maybe it's different at other places, but they are really leaning into this technology as a creative medium. Whereas I think many of the rest of us are a little bit more skeptical, but we do recognize that we have to prepare our students for the world in which they live. And not only that, but maybe, as the artists are kind of demonstrating, there are ways in which the engagement with this technology can be constructive, can be helpful, can actually facilitate the further development of the ways in which human beings have come to think over the last few hundred years in the Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment era, in which we have regarded ourselves as increasingly autonomous. I'll say more about that as we get into the question of regulation. But what I want to speak about today then is ethical guidelines as well as political regulations. But to do that, I think I need to give you a sense of how this technology actually works. And so there'll be some of all of those aspects. I pointed out to you last week, and this is really where we left off, and we had a rounded discussion for the second half of class last week, that they're both profound positive benefits from this technology, whether that is figuring out how to undo the damage of climate change or trying to get new therapeutic responses to some of the diseases that are responsible for much of the end-of-life misery that so many of people experience as part of human existence. This technology does seem to be promising to do things that on our own so far we have lacked the capacity to do so. And part of this is just the amount of information, the sheer bulk, the brute force of this technology that can compare images or databases, millions of data inputs at a time in a second, right? Things that the human mind simply cannot do, this technology does with ease. And as the processing power of our computers as the amount of information that is contained online continues to grow at an exponential rate, we certainly should anticipate that the brute processing power and the advantage is that confers for us, for our capacity to solve problems that up until this point seemed insoluble, that's just going to keep growing and growing and growing. So I think lots of promise there. And on the other hand, right, we've looked a little bit at, and we'll say more today about the idea that it could be a threat to our very existence, right? That it could permanently disempower the species. One of the books I'm reading on this envisions 10 different scenarios for human beings after the advent of super intelligence, machines that are more intelligent than we are across the full spectrum of forms of intelligence. And some of those scenarios include human extinction. And I'll say more about this, but that doesn't have to be deliberate. We don't have to have a Terminator kind of scenario or 2001 Space Odyssey kind of scenario in which the intelligence we've created decides to eliminate us, but just it's the byproduct of this intelligence having other aims than the survival of the human species. And the byproduct is that it somehow interferes with the conditions that are required for human life to continue on the planet. So that's a nightmare scenario. Another scenario is, in a sense, this technology decides to preserve the human species, but in the way that maybe we preserve endangered species in zoos, that it doesn't completely exterminate us, but that it both radically reduces the human population and our capacity to control our own fate or our own destiny. So obviously, those are awful scenarios, and I think up until quite recently, these were the stuff of science fiction. I will tell you, I'm reporting to you on work being done by physicists at MIT and by leading technologists at Oxford University. This is not sci-fi stuff anymore. This is a likely scenario. How likely? Nobody, I think, is really willing to, place numbers on it because there's too much uncertainty here. But it is no longer the stuff of our imaginary nightmare scenarios. It is foreseeable that this technology will do this to us. And so then this leads to the final range of questions I want to speak with you about, which is, what are the risks and what steps should we be taking in the 2020s to make sure that we do everything in our power to avoid those risks actually coming to bite us, while at the same time recognizing this technology can be very beneficial. How do we harvest the benefits while avoiding the risks? So just to give you a little bit more sense of where I see these risks, I'm going to sort them into three main levels of concern. The first I'm going to talk about is cultural, and this will be very continuous with what we've been talking about in this class up until this point, and that is the potential for profound and alterations of what and how we think, as aspects of our thinking are supplemented, complemented, or replaced by intelligent machines, right? So how does that change our culture? And here I'm going to differentiate a few different aspects of this transformation of the ways in which knowledge is produced verified and transmitted. This is sometimes called our knowledge system. And we seem to be moving away from a knowledge system in which, and we might call this the post-enlightenment knowledge system, we train experts in colleges and universities, in enterprises, and through professional certification and specialization, we come to defer and trust those who we believe have relevant, specialized knowledge and expertise, right? And so we see this a little bit in the pushback against the coronavirus pandemic regulations. We're not going to listen to the experts. We don't believe them. We don't think they actually know enough to listen to them. And I want to be as clear as possible, right? We do have to be somewhat skeptical of expertise, especially if we come to believe that it's actually just the interest of the experts or the group or the class or the status group that they come from being dressed up as expertise, and that it's bad for a lot of people to defer to experts in terms of their capacity to protect their interests. But having said that, it is also the case that I hope I don't need to convince you of this, that there is real advantage to having a society in which people concentrate on developing specialized knowledge, and the rest of us learn from the experts. And that involves a certain degree of deference, but also then institutionalized forms of accountability. So we've got a model there of a post-enlightenment knowledge system in which every knowledge producer, knowledge consumer, and those who engage in the discursive validation of knowledge claims, are all humans. And I think part of what we are going to need to wrap our heads around is that in the middle of the 21st century, that will no longer be the case. A substantial portion of what seems to be credible knowledge will be produced by intelligent machines. And as the ethical advisors to Microsoft and Google pointed out, this could undermine the factual basis of modern society. I could really interfere with the current knowledge system. I think we are already seeing that. And so one question then is, how do we regulate the production of knowledge by intelligent machines in such a way that we don't undermine our factual basis, don't forfeit all the advantages of the Enlightenment system for producing expertise and expert knowledge? Second issue, related but a little bit distinct, is how opinion, will formation, and transmission occur. And so I'm going to refer to this very broadly as the public sphere. How is it that we influence what each other think via trying to share ideas, persuade each other, argue with each other via the virality of memes, as it's sometimes called, right? How do pop music songs spread? Let me give you an example, the 1960s have taken the direction they took were it not for the Beatles and for the advent of, and I think it's worthwhile noting that up until the early 1960s, the BBC did not broadcast music. I don't know if you're aware of that, and certainly didn't broadcast popular music all day, all night, right? And so transformations in technology allowed for greater diversity of radio offerings, allowed for more popular music to be transmitted, allowed therefore for pop bands to start taking hold in Britain to a greater degree. And next thing, we've got the English or the British invasion. And let us recognize that the counterculture of the 1960s has a lot to do with, and I focus on the Beatles. It doesn't have to be the Beatles by themselves, but with the way in which popular music and other forms of popular culture were transmitted via the institutions of the public sphere. And then we have the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, and various other kinds of rights movement for LGBTQ people, for immigrants' rights, etc. And that all of this required a certain infrastructure of mass communication, and that as we have moved into the age of social media, digital media, uh, 300 channel cable or satellite TV, 24/7 news, and then Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, etc. We are now in an era where the media that we use to transmit our culture are fundamentally transformed. And as they change, so too does our culture change. And we are on the cusp of another, and perhaps the most profound of these new technologies transforming the nature of our public sphere, the very infrastructure that carries and conveys our culture is being transformed by this technology. What will this do to our culture? And how do we want to try to influence the direction of our cultural evolution through regulating this technology or through different ethical efforts to inform the way this new technology is used? Third issue, um, transformations of modes of social connection and socialization, right? And so part of what's happening here is that connectivity is getting easier. And there's a distinction in network theory and sociology between strong ties and weak ties. I have strong ties with the people I'm related to, the people I grew up with, my best friends, maybe some of the people I work with. I phone them, I see them, I visit them, I have dinner with them. We know each other's birthdays, etc. Right? And so those are strong ties. Weak ties, these are people I might have known in college, or maybe I know casually through work or through a professional association. And for most of human history, strong ties have been easier to maintain and have had stronger influence on the ways in which people act collectively. Weak ties are called weak ties in part because they tend not to have much social force. But this new technology has made it much easier for us to connect much broader groups together in looser networks that nevertheless are potentially incredibly socially significant. Again, I think we can think of protest politics in this century, and whether we're talking about the Arab Spring or Arab uprisings that occurred a decade ago, or Black Lives Matter, or hashtag Me Too, or the rise of right-wing populism and new forms of ethno-racial nationalism, what we're seeing is that now weak ties are more important in political, social, and cultural movements that are roiling our societies. And so that's one dimension of this. And another dimension has to do with socialization. And I am not of this generation. I know you're not of this generation, but I teach a generation of people who, in a sense, are maybe more concerned with the way they present themselves online in social and digital media than they are with how they present themselves in person to their peers. That the online self, the avatar self, the curated self of social media is the fundamental form that our public facing self takes, and that more time and energy are spent on working on that aspect of self-presentation than on the in-person aspect of self-presentation. And to me, this is a wholly new and different world, and one with which I want to say, mercifully not very well acquainted, but I just also have to recognize I grew up in a different era when this was not part of the way in which socialization occurred and social connections were navigated. And it is clear that this is having profound effects. And this goes then to the next category of cultural transformation, profound effects on the processes of psychological development. If you think of yourself primarily as the self presented to others in social media, as opposed to the self who shows up physically in context of actual interaction, you begin to develop yourself in different ways. We've talked about this before. We can talk about it again. The delayed or the slowing down of the development of empathy in the 21st century, the cognitive and emotional psychology literature on the development of empathy suggests that full understanding of the way in which you affect others and concern for it tends to develop maybe a little earlier in girls, a little later in boys, but generally speaking, in the early years of adolescence, maybe from around ages 12 to 14. And we're seeing delays in the development of empathy by 2, 3 years in younger children. And it seems to be the fundamental transformation is the displacement of face-to-face interaction by mediated or online or social media interaction, and that changes the way in which empathy develops. That's just one, I think, aspect of psychological development that has been altered. And I would point out that right now we're having a really hard time picking apart what aspects of current psychological development trends are accounted for by these transformations in our technology, and which are accounted for by the pandemic and what the pandemic did to schooling and other aspects of social life for people who are coming of age over the last 4 years. And part of the issue here is, of course, that the pandemic accelerated much of this technological development, or the degree to which people relied on this technology. Here we are in late 2023, you and I still talking on Zoom, right? And that's in part due to geographic considerations, not only health considerations, but it started in 2020 because of the pandemic, right? And so I just think we need to recognize what is probably exceptional for us may have become quite ordinary for people whose formative years occurred while much social interaction was driven online by a global pandemic. And then finally, one of the things we've been talking about again and again, transformations to the resources for self-interpretation. And here, the idea that we are perhaps entering a period where the central metaphor for how our mind works is going to be a technological computational metaphor, computational models of the mind, that we are increasingly relying on black box technology to do a lot of our thinking for us, and that we may increasingly come to view our minds as being black box technology too, I think represents a really deep shift in the cultural resources for thinking the self, for thinking about thinking, and it is happening. And again, this is much more an issue for ethics than for regulation. Well, at least we don't want to legislate how we think about ourselves for sure, but we do perhaps want to recognize some of the costs, perhaps, of changing the way in which we think ourselves. All right, so that's the category that I've got the most in, because I think in a sense it is the least intuitive, the most surprising. Two other categories of concern. One of them is social, and so we can think here of the economic effects. And please note that we've got a writers' strike in Hollywood. We have a UAW strike in much of the country right now. Can't really say Detroit anymore. And both of these strikes are in part motivated by the fact that both of these industries are being transformed by this new technology. And the workers in this industry want to say, slow down and treat us with fairness. Don't simply outsource to AI or robotics the jobs that we rely on. And I believe I've noted to you that the people who study this technology think that the low end figure of the jobs that will be eliminated or fundamentally transformed is 20 to 40%, that the high level figure is 50 to 60%. And I don't need to say, right, that a world in which we lose 20 to 40 to 60% of our jobs is going to be a very different world, and that this technology, unlike almost all previous technology, is technology that is intelligent, and in that respect it may not produce the dynamic that previous technological revolutions produced, which is, yes, the old jobs went away, but they were replaced with new jobs that in many respects may be better jobs. And it's just not clear to me, and I think to most people who study this, that that's the dynamic with this technology. But there are other economic effects that I think we need to take into account. Some of these are effects that produce greater inequality or greater concentration of wealth or greater concentration of influence. And so one of the effects, the so-called network effect of this technology, is that it used to be the case that if you wanted to hear a pianist perform live, well, you went to your local jazz club or your local chamber orchestra or your local symphony hall, and you therefore were supporting the talent of the local musicians, right? And let's say you're in Cleveland, Ohio. It may be that the musicians there are not as good as the musicians in New York or London or San Francisco, but nevertheless, they are what you have access to, and they are therefore who you support. Today, we can pop online and we can see a live performance at the Metropolitan Opera. I think that's one of the reasons that Liz sometimes doesn't watch this class live, right? She's looking at the Met Opera from Northern California playing live on her TV or computer, or you can even go to a theater to do this, and a movie theater, right? And this has changed then the degree of support that the local musicians get. And the result is that the local musicians are struggling. They're not making as much money, and that maybe the Metropolitan Opera is richer in the 21st century than it was 50 years ago. And so all kinds of hard to detect, but certainly disruptive economic effects. And then the nature of interconnectivity, how strong can those weak social ties grow when it's so much easier for us to join a Facebook group and be in touch with everybody who graduated from your high school in the same year you did, and not have to like go home for the reunion to see them all. That is creating maybe greater social connection, but please note that there is a countervailing trend here, which is social fracturing. It used to be if you were, and I'll use the terrible example, neo-Nazi, you might not know any other neo-Nazis. And so you felt maybe a little isolated and ashamed, as probably you should, about that political and ethical or unethical view. Today, the neo-Nazis can collect online, and very quickly you've got 1,000 or 2,000 like-minded people gathering in a Reddit stream, and they are reinforcing each other's ideas, emboldening each other. And so a smaller group begins to coalesce around maybe more radical, maybe more problematic ideas. I do think that this technology is not only connecting us, it's also fracturing us. I think some of the most influential and interesting writing on the 21st century is focused on this question. Why are we more polarized, but also more fractured, less able to get along? And I think the technology that we're using is a big part of this. And then I think the advent of artificial intelligence is going to likely accelerate these trends. And then finally, coming back to the stuff that I wish was science fiction, but I'm afraid is increasingly realistic scenarios, the threat of uncontrolled, and I'm going to use the term of art from the literature here, non-complementary superintelligence, right? So intelligence that exceeds our own intelligence. One of the examples that's used in some of the literature on this is the idea that as the machine intelligence revolution takes off, and please note that's not inevitable. There is a scenario in which this technology plateaus, and lo and behold, we have self-driving cars and machines that can read medical diagrams, but we don't have general intelligence in our machines that exceeds human intelligence. And then maybe this is still the stuff of sci-fi. But having said that, I think there's a good chance that within the next, and then the people who work for Google DeepMind think this is 20 years. The survey of AI people in general suggests maybe 30 years, the middle of the 20th century. The people who are more skeptical think it might take 70 or 80 years. But this is the direction that almost everyone who works on this technology thinks we're headed to eventually, sooner or later. What happens when our machine invented technology regards us, human beings, as primitive, as a perhaps childlike instantiation of intelligence? Does it continue to be docile, right? That's what I.J. Good asked, right? Does it allow us to control it? Does it somehow have programming built into it that it doesn't or can't modify? Because please note, one of the preconditions for superintelligence is that it begins to program itself, right? It begins to do the work of generating more and more intelligent machines. Does it allow us to control it? Does it allow us to set the parameters within which it operates? And if we are incapable of controlling it in that way, and I think it's reasonable to anticipate that we will be, because it will be able to outthink us, does it then of its own accord, and I'm not quite sure what language to use here, decide is the normal term, decide that it wants to do for its own reasons things that are compatible with what we want it to do, or that allow us to continue along our course without much interference from it. That's the complementary path of development between human intelligence and machine-based superintelligence. Or does it have priorities that compete with ours? And I'll just point out to you very quickly, I think most human beings in the 21st century do not want to bring about massive extinction of the flora and fauna of the planet of the 21st century. And yet that is exactly what we're doing. And why are we doing this? Not because we want a sterile planet or to significantly alter the Earth's biosphere, but because it is the inadvertent byproduct of other things that we want. We want to drive cars and fly planes and eat meat 3 meals a day and grow crops on less land and live in large cities and use lots of energy. And the byproduct of all that is that the planet is heating up, that the natural habitat of so many species is being altered, that the waterways and the airways are being polluted, that plastic is infiltrating the DNA of all life forms on the planet. And so we're in the middle of a great extinction, one of only 6 that have occurred in the history of the planet, so far as we can tell, that we are bringing about accidentally and that most of us regret. What is the guarantee that that won't happen with artificial superintelligence? Not that it wants to kill us, not that it wants to disable or disempower us or to make it hard for us to reproduce, but that what it does want ends up doing things that interfere with our capacity to reproduce, to sustain ourselves. And so I think we have to, in order to ask that question, answer that question, begin to think about how this intelligence operates and why it's so different from the way in which human intelligence operates. And so to do that, I want to introduce you to a variety of books. And I, by the way, I'm reading another one. So this is Melanie Mitchell's Artificial Intelligence, A Guide for Thinking Human Beings. I didn't get it onto my slide. Stephen Wolfram's What is Chatbot GPT Doing and Why Does It Work? He's a very influential contemporary computer scientist. Max Tegmark is the MIT-based physicist I was referring to, Life 3.0. Being Human in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. Nick Bostrom, who I've spoken with you about before in the context of thinking about climate change, is the head of the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford University, and his book, Superintelligence, Paths, Dangers, Strategies, has been one of the most influential books in this field. So that's some of the stuff I'm drawing on, and I wanted to spend a few minutes introducing you to how I've come to understand how this technology operates. And the reason to do this is to suggest to you that this is, in a sense, an alien intelligence. And in saying that, what I mean is that this is an intelligence that does not think the way we think. That's all, right? Not that it comes from outer space, but that it's and it's hard. These are metaphors, but its thought processes, for lack of a better term, the way in which it gets from its input to its output, call that its thought or thinking process, right? It gets some information, it does some work, it then generates something for us, is fundamentally distinct from the way in which we think. And I have to be as clear as possible. We don't know enough about the way we think or the way it thinks to be absolutely certain of that. But I think as you watch what I'm about to share with you, you will get a sense that something quite different is going on from what we think is going on in our heads. So that's where I want to go with the remaining time. The result is that I'm kind of doing a transition. So I wanted to stop for a second to see if you had questions, comments, thoughts about the dangers of AI, the three levels of change, the cultural, the social, the existential, or the three levels of concern, I guess I should say, before I move on. Okay, well, I've had my drink of water. I will keep going. As always, unmute yourself, put something in the chat if you have a question or a comment. Happy to start talking about them. So there's a lot on this slide, but this is my synthesis of, in particular, what a large language model is doing when it produces a semblance, a copy of intelligent human communication. And remember, what we're talking about here is chatbots. Large language models are ways of analyzing huge amounts of data and on that basis producing new, original communication, utterances, letters, books, novels, poems, songs that are not copied, are not generated by instructions, but are the machine's own original language production. How is it doing this? And so this is the example I think that is most helpful in thinking through why we should regard this as an alien intelligence, as something that is different from what we're doing. So let's talk about chatbots or large language models. What do they do? And what they do fundamentally, their basic operation is to produce a reasonable continuation of whatever text it has so far. So very often it is working with a simple prompt. And by the way, one of the really interesting things that I think people who are using this technology creatively are doing is getting a prompt, getting a result, using the result as the next prompt, and seeing how many iterations it takes to get to something that is actually what they were looking for from the technology. I'll give you a simple example. I want the technology to write a letter to my landlord telling them that my toilet is broken, it's leaking, and it needs to be fixed. Please write that letter, right? And so the chatbot will, if you give it the landlord's name and your address and your complaint, in a second, draft a letter for you, right? And you can edit it yourself, or you can give it further directions. I want it to be angrier. I want it to be nicer. I want it to be more threatening. I want it to be more urgent. And so depending upon how you modify it, you get maybe several drafts of it, but it does this very quickly. But what it has done in generating that letter is essentially to generate the next word and the next word and the next word and the next word. And so it has a sense of, if there are this many words and words of this content coming up until this point, what comes next? And the way in which it calculates, and I think that's the right word, what comes next, is because it has looked at, and here I'm gonna just give the number, billions of instances of language used. Let's say this is a letter in English in English, and so if it has the words, landlord, broken toilet, letter, it knows among the words associated with this is dear so and so. I'm writing because there's a broken toilet in my apartment and I would like you to repair it expeditiously, right? And so when you and I do that, I'm not sure. Well, maybe I am sure that we don't know how we do it, right? And that's part of the mystery. It flows out pretty naturally, but I do think we have an intention. We have some familiarity with the world and the way the world works, and the combination of the idea underpinning my effort at communication. I want my toilet fixed, and that map of the world that I work with. I have a landlord. It's my landlord's responsibility. He needs to be informed, and I need to express a desire about when he does it, how quickly he does it, etc. That leads to our communication having the content and the structure and the tone that it has. We're not just calculating what word goes next. And so at that level, I want to suggest that there seems to be a pretty deep difference between the way chatbots communicate and the way human beings communicate. Um, how they do this, and this is complicated, and I'm going to show you a little bit diagrammatically that I think helps to explain this. The first thing to see is that they use deep learning neural networks, and this is a breakthrough that has occurred mainly over the last 12 years. And Google in particular has been responsible for some of these developments and their dissemination. And Jeffrey Hinton, the one in the right slide, a couple slides back, who I highlighted as saying this technology is a profound risk to our society and humanity, is one of the pioneers of this so-called deep learning dispersed neural network technology. The key idea here is that as we got more advanced in understanding how the human brain works, and we could talk about the visual cortex for a little bit, we came to recognize not only are there billions of neurons that are networked in incredibly complicated ways in our brains, but they're organized in layers, that the initial input from the rods in our eyes, right? I think it's 64,000 light detectors in each eye, right? Puts neural inputs into certain neural networks, and those neural networks process that input and then put it to another network, another layer, and that network does some more processing and pushes it to another layer and to another layer. And then, by the way, it feeds back to some of those earlier layers, that it's not just bouncing around a brain-wide network, that there are nodes and layers that seem to organize the way in which the neural structure, the architecture of cognition of the brain works, that can be replicated or reproduced at the level of computers. And let me show you a little bit diagrammatically what I'm talking about here, and I'll give you more detail on this as we get a little further in. But as opposed to a simple single layer of computational neurons, right? The first two here constitute one layer, right? They feed into the next four. They constitute a second layer. They feed into the next three. They constitute a third layer. That then feeds into the final layer that feeds the output out, right? So input in, output out, but 1, 2, 3 layers before the final layer that does output, that organizing these artificial neural networks in this way, deep simply refers to the idea that they are layered, has allowed for much more rapid and accurate learning, right? And so one of the things to recognize here is that what I just showed you, right? There might have been 10 computational neurons in that network. In these chatbots, they rely on neural networks that have 175 billion connections. And by the way, what is a computational neuron? It's a little program or a little algorithm, and you might be able to see numbers, right, as that are being spat out by these little neural networks. A neuron, right, the stuff that our brains are made out of, the cells, fires when it reaches a threshold of neuroelectrical or electrochemical inputs. And when it fires at different strengths and perhaps also different kinds of neurotransmitters. And so what we do to simulate that is attach different values. These are ultimately calculations. So the input that this neuron got, it interprets as a -8. It then pushes forward a -8 to this next layer. And when this next layer gets -8 and +5, it does a calculation and it pushes a number forward. And one way to think about this, and this is not the way it's represented in this diagram, it can vary, but generally speaking, the ultimate value that you're looking for is somewhere between 1 and -1. Then what this diagram represents is a very simple task: sort images into cats, dogs, or neither cat nor dog, right? And so cat, dog, neither cat nor dog, +1, -1, 0. And then the question is, can we organize a neural network so that it accurately sorts all cats into cats and all dogs into dogs? And how do we know that it does that? Because it gets material that has been labeled by human beings as cat or dog. Some of this might be the computer scientists or the firm that owns the technology labeling the images, but the vast majority of it is actually already pre-labeled. Every time somebody goes on Facebook and says, "Look at my silly dog," or "Look at my cute cat," right? The computer trying to train itself to recognize cats and dogs can see the image and recognize that a human has called it a cat or a dog, and presumably it's a cat or a dog, and use the organization of its network to see if it actually recognizes it as a cat or a dog. And then in terms of the way this learning operates, what the machine is learning is essentially, if it assigns these weights to these neurons, does it accurately pick the cats and dogs as cats and dogs? And there's something called backward propagation, where if it makes a mistake, it tries to trace it back in the network and adjust those weights. And this is obviously a very simple diagram, but what we're really talking about, and it starts to get a little bit more complex up here, is hundreds of billions of connections and calculations. And then what the actual process of learning is doing is what's called training, and trying to minimize loss, where minimizing loss means minimizing the amount of mistakes it makes. And so in this diagram, right, if all the red is on the left and the blue is on the right and the yellow is on the top, then it has successfully, that's 100% success rate, right? Got cats as cats and dogs as dogs, and neither of the above, squirrels and skunks, as neither cat nor dog. And as you can see, when it first starts, it's not doing very well. It's bleeding all of those colors together. As it gets a little bit more complicated, it gets a little bit better. As the network gets adjusted, it gets a little bit better until it gets to the point where all of the images it's working with are correctly identified as belonging to the group that they belong to, right? And so that's the goal. And the process is one of adjusting all of these weights, billions of them, slowly but surely, and changing the weights and changing the way they relate to each other in order to get an accurate identification. And again, I just want to point out to you, I don't think this is what we human beings are doing when we learn to identify cats and dogs. But I would also point out to you that what happens here is opaque, right? You have a child, your child, right, is watching you, and you're reading them books about cats and dogs. You're living in a world with cats and dogs. You use the right word, and all of a sudden your child starts categorizing correctly, let us hope. Or if they make a mistake, you say, no, silly, that's a cat, not a dog. That's an animal that says meow, not woof, and they figure it out, right? So there's a sense in which we don't exactly know how we do what we do, but I don't think, and based on what we know about the brain, it doesn't look like it's what machines are doing. And I will need to continue this with you next week. But when it comes to language, what the machines are doing is something that is a much more complex version of what we just saw with cats and dogs. They are exposing themselves to billions of texts. Based on those texts, they're creating a sense of what goes with what. So here we have the animals that go together. For instance, alligators and crocodiles go together, and fruits and vegetables that go together. For instance, pineapple and coconut goes together. And then it gets more complex as we start bringing in more and more categories, not just nouns, but verbs, adjective, adverbs, pronouns. It also learns, and I think this is important, we don't teach it. It learns the structure of grammar, that a sentence diagram includes a noun phrase, a prepositional phrase, a verb phrase, perhaps another verb phrase, and that the words that it has put in meaning space also have to obey the right syntactical rules, end up in the right place in the sentence. And what it is doing when it writes something for us, when it talks to us, when it communicates with us, is something very much like this. On the basis of all this information, it is calculating what is the next word, the best word to put into the utterance that it is constructing. All right, so I do think I want to stop there. Again, I want to leave a little bit of time for questions, and I hope what I'm suggesting is beginning to become plausible. How worried should we be about sharing the world with intelligent machines? And my suggestion to you is, well, we should be worried about losing jobs, because those machines are already taking jobs away from us, right? But we should also be worried about how knowledge is reproduced and how social connectivity and socialization are reproduced, and ultimately about whether our aims will converge with machines' aims or not. Well, how do we estimate how different it's going to be from us or how much it may diverge from us? And here I want to suggest understanding the way in which we think and the way in which it thinks helps us to see that this is a very different kind of thought process, a very different kind of way of relating to the world that the machines are engaged in, as opposed to what we're engaged in. And that, in a sense, I think amplifies my concern. It's not as if all of a sudden the apes are learning to speak, that they might be quite akin to us, or we figured out how to communicate with whales and dolphins. That might be very illuminating for us. This is a very different kind of thing that we are now beginning to share the world with, and that may ultimately modify us in really hard to anticipate ways. I'll stop there. Who has questions or thoughts, including, I'll do my best, technical questions that I might be able to help you with? Flossie, go ahead. Hold that space bar down to unmute yourself.
I also hear that China is working with embryos and modifying them and making them very specialized embryos. And they have succeeded in producing not one superhuman being, but several. And I don't know that that is exciting or scary or both.
So I have not heard anything about experiments in genetic engineering succeeding in producing superhumans anywhere in the world. But I will point out to you, one of the books, I happen to have my stack of books next to me today that I'm reading as I continue to think about these topics. I believe I've mentioned to you before Yuval Noah Harari, right? A pretty well-known Israeli historian and futurist, and his book Homo Deus: A Brief History of Tomorrow, and then there are other books like this, do point out that we basically have the technology right now, the CRISPR technology, to begin experimenting with genetic engineering in the embryo, or before the embryo is even implanted, to for instance generate 1,000 embryos and try to modify each of them or select which one has the traits that we are looking for, and then implant a human being who is going to be smarter, or a taller, better looking, more creative, faster, more athletic, right? And so this is not, again, science fiction. This is, we don't know how dangerous this will be biologically, or what the social ramifications of this will be. But people like Harari suggest we need to be prepared for this, and we need to have regulations as well as ethics to help us think through this world. I have to admit, Flossie, that's not what I was really planning on speaking with you about today, but I do think it's obviously adjacent. It's quite close to these themes, and also a matter for concern. What used to be the stuff of science fiction in our technologically advanced society is more and more realistic, and we have to be prepared and figuring out what we want to do about it. Thank you, Flossie. And anybody else with a question or a comment for today? Let me just ask real quickly, is this making sense? I'm gonna do a little bit more of the pull up the hood and see how this stuff works stuff with you. Is this something that either you had some familiarity with already, or at least via what we're discussing, it's beginning to make sense to you? I'm getting nods, and okay, good. Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Wendy. I
I
just
have a question. I
Oh,
have a
go
question.
ahead, Barbara. That not a
Yes,
wave, but a hand raise. Okay, go
yeah,
ahead.
both, yes, and a hand raise. I was intrigued by your reference to the fact that we have certification and licensing programs, coursework that people have to do, and demonstrations of proficiency. Um, I hope in the future you'll say more about that, and because I don't think AI programs are going to be passing any licensing tests or doing any practicums to show how they dress a wound or uh, build a wheelchair or other things that some of us might be interested in.
Yeah, and I would say let me see if I can stop that.
I think I
Sorry.
said Marion.
There we go. Yeah, I got it back under control. Right now we're still deferring to human expertise, right? And so the reason that, for instance, we trust artificial intelligence to read mammograms or radiologist reports is
Yeah.
because the experts in the field have determined that this technology actually does a better job. And by the way, they have also tried to set up some monitoring so that the technicians who have a lot of experience and are very good at it are double checking, right, the work of
Yes.
the AI. And by the way, you probably know about this lawyer, right, who submitted a brief that he asked chatbot to write for him, and chatbot fabricated the cases, right? And so the lawyer actually got disciplined for having submitted a brief that had made up precedents. And
Yes.
so you have to edit it, you have to scrutinize it, you have to fact check it, etc. But having said that, it's also the case that right now you could go on Amazon and buy a guidebook to Venice, for instance, and you would be buying a guidebook that's been written by a chatbot, by some clever but not particularly ethical entrepreneur who hopes that they'll be able to hoodwink you into buying a book that he didn't have to pay anybody to write, right? And similarly, one of the things that's really trending on TikTok right now, which I have to admit I don't spend any time about, so I'm just I'm just reporting what I hear, is these so-called science videos that purport to tell you about recent UFO sightings or what happened to the dinosaurs, and they're generated by chatbots. They are completely fabricated, but they sound quite credible. And by the way, the people digesting them are often 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 years old and don't have any real wherewithal to second guess what seems to be a credible expert presenting some history to them, right? And so, or some science to them. And so I do think when we talk about the erosion of the factual basis of society, part of the issue here is we've always had this competition, right? Let us remember that the very first newspapers, and we now, for the most part, I think, esteem our newspapers as presenting us with reliable information. The very first newspapers got a lot of their circulation by writing reports in the early 19th century about the discovery of life on Mars, complete with drawings of the Martians, right? Completely fabricated, but it sold a lot of newspapers. And so this is not new, right? This is a constant tension between a capitalist market economy in which people do things to make profit and a knowledge system in which we hope people with expertise will convey verifiable and valuable knowledge to us. And those two things sometimes work together and sometimes don't work together. The reason we have regulations is to try to keep opportunistic and predatory people from making a whole bunch of money by disseminating a whole bunch of falsehoods. And I think it goes without saying, in the 21st century, we're not doing very well at this right now. And I do think a fair bit of this has to do with the way in which our technology has changed our capacity to have gatekeepers, to have filters, to have experts in charge of what actually gets broadly disseminated, as opposed to said at the local bar. You can sit over your beer and say, I think I saw a UFO the other night, and I think the government is covering it up, and maybe your friends guffaw with you about this idea. But that's different from producing a polished YouTube or other kind of social media broadcast using AI that seems to be very scientific, official, and convincing, and gets viewed by hundreds of millions of people and makes you a small fortune in the process. That's
Right.
the world we're in now. Yeah.
Fingers crossed that we keep
Yeah.
ahead of it. Thank you.
You bet, Barbara. Thank you. Bob, you had your hand up a few minutes ago. Has the point passed or not?
No, not really. Essentially, you've pointed me to the fact that maybe I want to try to use this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And so a couple of things. Do you have any suggestions or recommendations on what actual software to use? I know I've used ChatGPT, but I understand there are better ones than that nowadays. And then so that's basically the question.
Yeah, so
This other stuff is too deep for me.
yeah, I don't have a recommendation, and so part of the issue here is it's interesting. I actually have a student who is trying to work with this right now and help me with my research by working with it, and it's interesting to me because I was deliberately a little vague in the instructions I gave to the student to give to the chatbot to help me with my research project, because I wanted to see where it would go. And it went 180 degrees opposite from the direction I wanted it to go. But it wasn't bad. It was in certain respects illuminating, and not illuminating in the sense that I think I learned a lot from it, but illuminating in the sense that, it gave a sense of what's out there in the literature that I'm working on that is influential or represents the kind of current thinking. And so I have to admit, modestly impressed with it, even though it was 180 degrees the opposite direction from where I wanted to go. That was the most recent iteration of ChatGPT. And so I don't know what's better. Bard seems to be getting a lot of bad press these days, right? That's the Google version of it. And I don't know, they've just upgraded it so that it works with your Gmail, etc. And I think one of the questions is, are they going to iron out the wrinkles, or did they move too fast and it's going to be problematic for a while? But so no, I'm sorry, Bob. I would encourage you maybe to do a little bit of your own research on this. Let me know what you learn, and that could be in the form of reading articles about it, or just playing around with it and seeing what works and what doesn't. And I think with a healthy measure of caution and skepticism, this is technology that we can learn from and that we can use. And by the way, it may help us to eliminate a whole bunch of drudgery ultimately, that we would all be better off not having to spend our time that way, assuming we do better things with our time. I'm not a Luddite. I'm not adverse to using this technology. And as they say, the horse is out of the barn. Even if I were, there is not much we can do to put the genie back in the bottle. The question is, how do we regulate? That's where we're going.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Anybody else with a question or a comment at this point? Okay, everybody, good being with you. I swear I'm in the final lap on this topic. I know there's a UAW strike and there are indictments and politics and stuff happening in the Ukraine. Lots of stuff for us to be talking about. We will get back to that stuff as well. But let's wrap this up first. All right, take care and see everybody next week. Thank you so much. Bye, guys.